There are more than 100 unique styles of beer, each with their own set of ingredients, process, guidelines, history, and experience. If you're a beer lover, an industry leader, or somewhere in between, a better knowledge of beer style will improve your life and your work.
Welcome to A Sense of Beer Style, essential beer style training for those who want to lead in food and beverage. I'm Julia Herz.
And I'm Jeremy Storton.
We're advanced Cicerones, beer judges, home brewers, and we're excited to guide you through the vast and wonderful world of beer styles.
All right, everyone, and Jeremy, my beer tasting partner in crime, welcome to A Sense of Beer Styles Prepisode on, drumroll please, Jeremy?
Today we are talking about what is beer.
And what is beer? We are going to talk about the definition of beer, like what is it in the first place? And then we're going to go higher level. We can certainly do a show, 3 hours, 5 days on each of these individual topics, but not just what is beer, but the components of beer, as in the ingredients, malt, hops, yeast, water, high level on the types of brewing process and variations of that, carbonation, the difference between commercial and home brewing, and then we'll bring you back home, summarize everything, and send you on your way.
Yeah, I think it's important for everyone to have just a basic breadth of knowledge as far as, what is it we're talking about really, and knowing where our beer comes from, where the ingredients come from, and just have a general awareness of that. So that's the whole purpose of the show today.
Yep, and I'm going to dive in and give that, kick us off with the first kind of my version of what is beer. And, big picture, we had beer before bread, right? I just read in Oxford Companion to Beer that Noah had beer on the ark as documented. Beer's been used as currency. Shakespeare talked about beer in his plays. It's used for nourishment and was used as a water replacement to replenish our, and quench our thirst when they were, dealing with contaminated water, and still in many areas of the world, that is the case. It's the most popular fermented beverage in the world. I think that's fair to mention when you talk about what is beer. But getting at the actual, what the heck is the beverage? Well, it's a fermented beverage. And the Beer Judge Certification Program, which A Sense of Beer Style certainly follows the guidelines for that as we take you through these beer styles. BJCP gets at the beer style breakdown of how they approach beer styles. But more importantly, on the higher level of what the beverage is, I went to two sources. The Brewers Association, who I work for proudly, has their World Beer Styles, breaks that out to what's judged at World Beer Cup and Great American Beer Festival. So if you look at the Great American Beer Festival guidelines for beer, for example, it's very specific to say 51% of fermentables come from grain, and it must have hops, except there are exceptions for, say, styles like Brew It, right? That are, it's a historical style, and Brew It was around before we had even the invention of hops to be added to counterbalance the residual sugar from malt.
Yeah, of course, we're talking like the 500s.
Totally, way back in the day. So beer can be without hops in certain, arenas. The other guidelines I went to kind of look at and ground this topic, and then I'll be done with my overview, is the Trade Bureau, the Tax and Trade Bureau for the U.S. federal government. And I certainly recognize and hope we have international listeners too. But it's interesting and grounding to read theirs. They define it as beer, ale, porter, stout, or sake that is at least 0.5% or more of alcohol from malt or substitutes. They allow substitutes to be rice, grain, bran, glucose, sugar, and molasses. Then they go on to define malt beverages and many other different types of categories. So I think kind of for the laywoman and person listening, if you want to know what beer is and explain it to somebody else in a very People magazine way, it's basically a fermented beverage from malted grains. And often in the style that you are drinking will have hops or other herbs and spices to counterbalance the flavors of the malt. And that, my friends, is my big version of what is beer.
Yeah. And I think it's kind of fun to think about too that, we have a grain-based alcohol as opposed to a fruit-based alcohol. So, I always think about if we were to have a friendly game of tag or something like that, and we had to pick teams, you'd have wine and cider on one side, and then you'd have beer and whiskey and sake on the other side, and mead would probably be the referee or something like that. But you kind of have
so well done. Wow, what a great way to break it down. I love it. And they all have water, right? Yeah. Water is a key common theme amongst them, but it's mostly, to me, what differentiates what you just described in those groupings of different beverage alcohols is the main fermentable, right? What are they fermented from? The process also comes into play. Yeah. But I think we got everybody grounded.
Yep.
So now, Jeremy, why don't we go through the core ingredients with you kicking us off to malt.
Yes.
What is malt?
I'm going to talk about malt because I love hops, but I am a malt head. I love the complexity of malt, and to me it's a fascinating thing. It can get very intricate. If you want to learn more, definitely study it. But if we think about what malt is, we need to go all the way back to barley. The product that we use is mostly barley. Sometimes we can use wheat and rye and other grains, but primarily we're using barley. The part that we're using of barley is really the seed, and how we take that seed is first, we've all heard of sprouted grains. We take that and we wet that seed down. We make that seed think that it's growing, so that it starts to grow some roots. And in the beer world, we call those chits. And you've probably seen some good chit lager and stuff like that. That's because they're using these sprouted barley seeds. And at that point, what that does is that makes the starches available for what comes next in the process. These seeds are really locked down like Fort Knox. And so we have to trick these seeds into thinking they're growing and getting ready to expend these caloric resources to turn into a plant. But we stop it before it can do that. At that point, we then dry these seeds, and then we kiln them to different temperatures, different degrees, from very, very pale light for like Pilsner malt, all the way to dark black patent malt. So we can get base malts, we can get flavor malts, we can get color malts. But we're basically taking these seeds and we're roasting them like green coffee beans or like bread in a toaster. We're trying to cultivate flavor out of the stuff. And it's these variations of color and flavor, both in base malts and specialty malts, that really gives us the tools of the trade. And the thing that gets me excited about this is, back in my days of playing music, people would talk about blues as 3 chords and the truth. And basically, if you think about any blues song, you've got 3, maybe 4 chords with a bridge or turnaround, but you have billions of different songs out there just with 4 chords. If you take these variations of malt out there and think about what you can create with all these different variations, not just from the hundreds of varieties of barley, but just the hundreds of maltsters out there creating their own unique signature flavor, we have endless opportunity and ability to create a signature flavor. And it's just, to me, that's exciting. But that's where we get our malt flavors from.
I love it. And to round out just 2 concepts, and please add to this if I'm going off in a direction that is can be further refined and more helpful to our listeners. So it's a process, right? Malting, the act of malting is a process of taking the grains to convert them to get them ready for fermentation. And what Jeremy basically just described is that you're using heat, and heat tricks the grain into thinking often it's spring, gets it to sprout and germinate, and then you have accessible enzymes for the yeast to find the sugars within that grain. So without malting, and the heat process, and there's the level of kilning and roasting, that's a varying of degrees Fahrenheit, that is a big strata. You frankly don't have your fermentable to start with.
Yeah. And I think a good contrast, I'll just throw this bit out there too, with my rudimentary understanding of wine, when the talent of the winemakers is to understand through all the terroir and temperature and rainfall and soil types that they find, they get the grape at its perfect optimal moment of what they're looking for, and then they begin to make their wine. The almost the opposite is true with barley. or with malt, where we use our understanding and our knowledge and our talent to create the malt. We have a direct hand in the process of creating the flavors that we want. And to me, again, that's just the exciting part.
Right. And there's the grain and the whole culture behind that on the farming and agricultural side. And there's, heritage and heirloom grains that are certainly being malted and fermented these days. There's an entire exciting, especially in the last 10 years, craft malting movement with farmers that are working with craft maltsters. And Jeremy, you're probably involved behind the scenes with this amazing organization. But I think within itself, as I said, malt, hops, yeast, water, what we're going to talk about in this What is Beer cast, it could all be their own show. But I like the big picture overview. Yeah. And if you're open to it, friend, now we will move on and I'll kick us off on an overview of hops.
Yep, you got it.
Okay, great. So you can have beer without hops for certain styles, certainly. But hops is the counterbalance to the malt in most beers. So big picture, hops, there's 100+ different kinds being used by brewers today. Many different microclimate and agricultural areas in the world are growing hops, but it's important to note that a common, latitude, 30 to 52 latitude is discussed for the sweet spot of the temperatures. Think about taking the globe and cutting it down the middle in a wide array, and there's the top here and the bottom here. In the middle is often where it is most beneficial, and that's where a lot of the German noble hops have been known to be grown, or the United States Pacific Northwest, Montana, and Idaho are very well known for being in that sweet spot of perfect temperatures and good moisture that contributes to the hops. So, what do hops do to beer? They contribute flavor, they contribute aroma, bitterness, mouthfeel, and through the mouthfeel, and I'm a big mouthfeel lady, you're going to hear that again and again, hops have resins like lupulins, right? They have essential oils, which contribute to the body. There's like 300 chemical compounds documented on these essential oils. They deliver for the mouthfeel tannins and astringency and a grippiness from the actual hop flower. And that is, polyphenols that you will certainly notice in the mouthfeel of beers that have been influenced by hops. And so they also not just limited to what I described, but also aid in head retention. That could be another show, there's a lot of geekiness we could get into, but they aid in head retention. And a super good trick, when I serve people beer, I say, if you want to know how truly bitter a beer is, because foam is 25% beer, dip your pinky into the foam and taste the foam. And you will not have that residual sugar from the malt balancing the hops, but the hop essential oils that have been isomerized will be noticed in that color of foam. So it's a real good way to dial in on that true kind of residual bitterness in the beer. There is a notion called BU to GU, and I will let Jeremy trigger me to get to that later.
Yeah.
But also besides head retention, all the things I mentioned of, the flavor, aroma, bitterness, mouthfeel, it's also a preservative, right? A lot of the Belgian lambics will age their hops for 4 years. There's really no aromatic compounds left or volatiles to contribute to a lot of the aroma and flavor, but that sense of bitterness and the vegetal matter will help as a preservative for beers. So when you work with hops as a brewer, you're often only working with the female cones. The male cones are not used for brewing. Humulus lupulus is Little Wolf, and that is the name of the actual strain. No hops do not have THC, but they are a part of the cannabinoid family. That's a whole nother discussion. We could get into terpenes and all of that stuff. And then there's country characteristics. I brought up German noble hops in the Pacific Northwest, and those hops are going to taste different characteristic-wise from, the German noble hops that are known to almost go to minty, right, and be a little more floral. English hops can go to perfume or earthy, right? American hops are either the tropics or the forest, as I call it. There's alpha and beta acids in hops, and you certainly, are using hops as a brewer for the bittering or as an aroma or as a dual purpose. That's the kind of thing you're thinking about when you're procuring hops for a recipe. And I mentioned isomerized. When we get bitterness from hops, hops need to be exposed to heat to have that bitterness be available into the beer. And you can add hops to beer in the form of the cone. as pellets, right? As extract. There's all sorts of varieties and a whole business built on how to take from the beautiful hop vine and give brewers the amazing ingredient to work with. But it's not just in one form. And then I'll close it out with two little concepts that are important. One is hops do lead to light struck. So friends, when you're drinking your beer on the patio and the sun shining on it, if you might taste the sense of sulfur or burnt match, that's a chemical reaction, photochemical reaction that has occurred between sunlight and the hops, and it gives off flavors that the brewer did not intend. So you can pay attention to light struck. Don't store your beer in the sunlight or drink it. If you drink it in the sunlight, just be aware.
Just
and
drink
the last
fast.
thing is drink it fast. Totally. And the last thing is, if you homebrew or brew, hops are toxic to dogs, and you do not want them to eat the residual hops that you have brewed with. You could have a very sick dog or even death for that animal that you're a guardian of. So be aware of that.
Yeah, and before I dive into yeast, I want to share a couple fun facts about hops. One is, we talk about bitterness, and some cultures, I think the American culture is one of them, where we're not particularly fond of bitterness as a flavor, something that we try to avoid. But and we'll talk about this later when we get into more food pairing type stuff. But bitterness is one of these basic tastes that we need to balance out the sweetness. There are a lot of beer styles that without just a small amount of bitterness, it would be what the term we use is cloying. And to me, the best way I can describe that is it's so sweet, it's annoying. That's what cloying is to me. The other fun fact about this too is hops grow on very, very tall bines with a B, and they can grow 30 feet tall. It's an amazing thing to go see a hop field. The other fun fact about hops is because they're a vine, they are triggered by sunlight, not by temperature, not by altitude, not by anything else. But when we hit our springtime and the days start to lengthen, that triggers the plant to start growing. And in June, when the days start to shorten, that's what triggers it to start budding flowers, and which is why we, in the Northern Hemisphere, have our harvest time in late August, September, and around April in the Southern Hemisphere, is because of that sunlight is what triggers it. And I don't know any other plants. Of course, I'm not a herbologist, but I don't know any other plants that act like that. But that was just kind of a fun, nerdy fact for anyone who wants to share this at a party. I'm going to take a swig. Let's talk about yeast.
Yeah, and I'd love you to take us through that, Jeremy.
Yeah.
Please.
Yeast, this is the fun thing. Yeast is found everywhere. Yeast is found in my beard, in your eyebrows, on plants, on fruit, anywhere that there's a potentially a sugar source, you're going to have yeast. And the reason for that is yeast is essentially a single cell organism. The fancy Latin word for that is Saccharomyces, and that basically means sugar fungus. So it is related to a fungus, but these little critters are alive, and so you have people who have gone out to cultivate yeast and propagate yeast, and then purify the culture. So you have a single culture so that we can have a very specific type of beer. Once upon a time, we'd had mixed cultures, and so beer often went sour, went funky, and it was kind of like Forrest Gump's box of chocolates. You never knew what you're going to get. But somewhere in the 1800s, we purified the cultures, and so now we can have very clean beer. We have basically two types. We have Saccharomyces cerevisiae, which is ale yeast, and we have Saccharomyces pastorianus. Used to be called Carlsbergensis, but it's now pastorianus. These are lager yeasts. The simple way to think about it is ale yeast, they ferment on the surface because the way that their cell structure is that they basically capture these carbonation bubbles and put them on like a life vest, and so that they float on the surface and have their big old party. Lager yeast are a little bit different. They have a slick cell, and so they sink to the bottom and do their work very, very slow. And ale yeast, they're the ones who like southern latitudes and like to have big, fun, raging parties. I think of them as the people down in Key West just having a good old time where it's nice and warm. And so the parties, the fermentation it equates to a party that burns out pretty fast and is done within a week usually. Kveik yeast, I jokingly say within minutes, but it's actually just a few days because that's just a raging party. Lager yeast strains, the Pastorianus versions, they are northern folk who like to put on warm jackets and just do their work very, very slow. But lager yeast end up just having a very clean profile, very few fruity esters, very few phenols, if any. And so it's just a very staid type of flavor profile. Ales, going back down south where the parties are, there's lots of fruity esters. There's lots of phenols depending on the type. But the bottom line is yeast is everywhere. You can cultivate yeast in your backyard. A lot of brewers do. A lot of home brewers do. But professional brewers need those pure cultures. And so oftentimes they will get them from different companies that provide this pure yeast. And as a brewer, you need to make sure that these cells, the yeast is alive, it's a well. And frankly, brewers get a lot of credit for making beer, but they're just, I call them yeast ranchers. They create this environment to let their yeast do all the hard work and heavy lifting. And so brewers' job is to create an environment and keep their little ranch animals happy. And that's how we get beer.
So such a fantastic big picture overview. And as we tag team each other, we round each other out. So
yeah.
Only one or two concepts came to mind to really share Jeremy's amazing higher level picture on what yeast is the concept of ale yeast. And he mentioned top fermenting and, warmer fermentation temperatures. The characteristics flavor wise derived from ale yeast often is what you would hear as is ester driven, right? Mm-hmm. Ester and phenols are something that we'll talk about in a whole nother prepisode, but that fruity sense of ester-driven characteristics will be mentioned in the style guidelines. And then lager yeast tends to give us sometimes sulfitic, right? Sulfur style derived compounds, and you'll see those in the style guidelines. There's also mention of Weizenale yeast, which is its own, at least Cicerone and BJCP look at that as its own type of yeast tied to German style wheat beers. It's considered an ale yeast, though. And then, there's all the other microorganisms that we could riff on, but we'll make that an entire other show. Yeah. And I think it's good to always tie it back to the style guidelines if you are studying from them, and the way the Beer Judge Certification Program talks about fermentation terms tied to yeast is clean fermentation profile. You'll read this from their overview as the quality of having very low or no yeast-derived fermentation byproducts in the finished beer, typically implying that there are no esters, diacetyl, acetaldehyde, or similar components. So that's kind of the shorthand for saying it's a very clean derived beer from the other ingredients, and it's not very yeast-driven in its flavors, which would give a good example. Belgian-style beers are often very yeast-derived and not clean fermentation profile style beers. They are very flavor component-wise from the yeast itself. So that's just one example in the mix.
Thank you for listening to A Sense of Beer Style, the essential beer style training for those who want to lead in food and beverage. With Advanced Cicerones, me, Julia,
and me, Jeremy.
Tune into the next episode as we continue exploring the world of beer styles and what to make of them. We encourage you to listen to the Prepisodes to build your foundation and better understand beer styles.
And before the next episode, I'd like to ask you to review the show and let us know what you'd like featured in upcoming episodes. Until next time, here's to you and your sense of beer style. Thank you for listening. Cheers.